Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. I've cracked out an old favourite today, my tote bag devoted to James Joyce and Bloomsday and the events that I went to about 20 years ago now. And I've chosen that book bag because we are going to be talking about Joyce. We are going to be talking about Dublin. I've got a fantastic Dublin guest for you today. He's a filmmaker, so it's a little bit different for the book bag. Why, you might say, am I inviting a filmmaker into the book bag? Because he's made documentaries about this man and about this man. He's even made documentaries about this man, and that's William Blake. And most pertinently of all, a great collaborator was this man, wonderful Irish poet, Niall McDevitt. So I'm going to be covering as much of that as I possibly can with the filmmaker, Sé Merry Doyle, and I'm about to welcome him. Welcome, Sé, into the book bag. Hello.
Great to see you. Good. Let's see what happens.
Lovely to see you, Sé. Well, I thought, if you don't mind, I'd like to take you back to Dublin.
Nice.
You are a Dublin boy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how you got into film. So tell us a little bit about that. Did you train as a filmmaker in Dublin?
Well, I didn't train in anything really. I shot out of the blocks from school at 16 and joined the local drama group. And then somehow or other, through a woman called Agnes Spinell, I ended up in a place called the Project Arts Centre, which is a bit like the Travers and Edinburgh and Fringe theatres in London. Very small, doing left of field plays, Irish, international, bringing the world into Dublin. And that was really important because Dublin was still not a backwater. It had its history of literature, but it was going through a difficult time with emigration and this, that, and the other. And I joined a project, and Jim Sheridan, a young Jim Sheridan, took over. And in the company was Gabriel Byrne, Liam Neeson, lots of people who would later, as we know, go on. And John Burman came to Ireland. He gave Liam and Gabriel a part in Excalibur and gave Neil Jordan his first writing debut in cinema. And they then went to America, quite famous. I continued on in Dublin. And then we were putting on a play about De Valera, kind of open theatre where actors became, ordinary people would walk in and become actors. And my job was to do the sound and visuals. So there was a need for some film of people relating to the emergence of the Republic, like Michael Collins and various people. And I found this old film, Misha Era, and the guy allowed me to edit a small section from it. I didn't know what editing was. He taught me what it was. And I put together this short sequence. Image comes up, lights, gunshots, and so forth. And the next morning after the first night, I came into the project and Gabriel and Liam were saying, "Hey, you got all the best reviews." I said, "What do you mean? Look at the Irish Times." And the Irish Times, Kane Archer said, "Good play, but the highlight for me was this 60-second history of Ireland in 60 seconds flat by Sé Merry Doyle." So I got its review. So I said, what is editing? And I went along. There was only two editing houses, Brian Cash and Windmill Lane studio. So I went to Brian Cash. I said, "It says here I'm a great editor." And he said, "Oh, yes. Problem is we don't have any vacancies right now, but you should go down to Windmill Lane because I hear that they've got too many women and they're looking for a guy." This was the equivalent of a guy starting on a building site. He was told to get the glass hammer. So I went down to Windmill Lane, and it was very hip with, lots of girls going around dogs and so forth. And I said, "Look, it says here I'm a great editor." So they gave me a job. So I became really an editor for the next number of years, worked with a lot of people, got a bit of a name. I was naturally an editor. It just was very natural to me. It was like saying in theatre, if you're going to have a close-up, you bring on a light, you bring all the other lights down. And really, in a way, editing was trying to find where do you want to take the people. So that became my career. Then I started to say, maybe I could make a film. So I made my first film in Dublin, which was really about the demolition of all the early Georgian tenement houses that would have been associated with Sean O'Casey. And that was a kind of a mild hit, shot on what we call pneumatic videotape. But interestingly, it had a very young U2 playing on the top of a community hall, which only a few weeks ago, Letterman bought some of this material for his biopic on U2, and they gave me $8,000. So I said, okay,
Nice.
which ties in with something that as a filmmaker for me was fundamental. How to make a film that will last the test of time, that it won't be just transient, that people will watch this forever. And I constantly did that. So for instance, Patrick Kavanagh, No Man's Fool, and I'm going to talk about Patrick, just got shown at the South Bank. And even though it was 10 years old, it really stood up, you know. So so theatre, kind of an odd leap into film as an editor, and then ultimately becoming a director. And that's really been my life, just telling stories.
Yeah. Yeah. And the stories are Irish stories, aren't they? There's always some connection.
There's always some connection. I mean, some of them, like Jimmy Murakami, Non-Alien, was really about a man who, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, him and his family, all Japanese, were put into a concentration camp. And he never forgave America. He became a very famous animator. When the wind blows, When the Wind Blows, the nuclear film, and Snowman. And he was quite a big breed. He never forgave America. He came to Ireland to a small film, and he fell in love with an Irish girl. And he never told anybody about this aspect of his life. And I met him during his retirement years, and he told me. And the next thing I knew, I was taking him back to Northern California to the prison camp. But yet, it had an Irish seed. Sometimes the stories went out, like a film I made about The Quiet Man, John Ford's Quiet Man, an Irish story. But it really took me on a journey of Irish emigration, because Ford's father left Ireland and went to Portland, Maine, and he became the most important filmmaker in America. So I had the pleasure of interviewing Peter Bogdanovich, Martin Scorsese, and also some crazy people in Kong, where the film was set.
Oh yes, the humour is incredible. Yeah, just talking to the people in the village and what they think of the film, how the film has impacted on their lives. The film The Quiet Man.
Well, it's kind of interesting in a way, because when I made that film, Nancy, who became as big a hit in the film as Scorsese, I always think that person can stand on that person. And a lot of broadcasters say, well, why is that? Actually, what the early pilot said, why is that crazy woman in the film? I said, well, she was around the time when the film was made, and they didn't like it. But then one guy in the Irish Film Board, it's like a totally opposite view. He said, who is that wonderful woman? And here's the money. So making films, you should always not doubt yourself. Like everybody in Ireland always says about Farther Ted, oh, Irish television wouldn't buy it. But one of the writers countered, said, no, that's not quite true. We went around at least 20 production companies in London and Britain, and they all said no, until one guy said, I love this, I'll commission you. So you've got to persist if you believe in your idea.
Yeah, it just takes one person as well, the right person to unlock the whole thing.
I'm always looking for that person.
Still looking. Yes. I mean, you interviewed Maureen O'Hara in that film, didn't you? And
yes.
I was going to ask you. So you kind of edit yourself out mostly, don't you? You're prompting and you're asking the questions.
Yes.
And so your interview technique is obviously pretty sharp, you know, to deal with a lady like Maureen O'Hara. Yes. Do you need bundles of charm?
Well, I won't go into why or what, but I always get on well with females. In general, I think I'm a good conversationalist, and I don't do interviews, I have conversations. With Maureen, when I was making the film, everybody said, have you got Maureen O'Hara? I said, no, I'm trying to get her. I spoke to her hairdresser, and I spoke to all sorts of people. It was a no. And then I met her nephew, Charlie Fitzsimons, in LA. I talked to him, and like the way Americans said, have you spoke to Maureen? I said, no, I've tried everything, she won't do. He said, I like you. And next thing, I got to go ahead, and I was invited down to Glengarriff. All the crew and all her friends were terrified because she's feisty. But we really clicked. You know, we really. And I visited her many times after the film, and I did small films for her where she'd be greeting Americans for St. Patrick's Day. But she was an extraordinary woman, and her passing, she was in a lot of ways a very underrated actress. But she'd never given an interview on The Quiet Man because she didn't trust. She said, they're going to make fun of it. And once she knew that, no, I like, I'm the whole reason I'm making Dreaming the Quiet Man is to prove that the naysayers were wrong about this film and misinterpreted. Maybe because it was in Ireland particularly, it was two-stage Irish, but that has now gone through revisionism, and now people, yeah, we get it, it's a classic. In a way, same thing, not quite, but could be said about the Banshees of Inisherin, whereas some people could come out and say, absolutely, but even last night, lots of people said, that terrible film, anti-Irish and all the rest. And all I can counter is in the same way as John Ford. Why would John Ford, the greatest filmmaker of films like Searchers and all these, why would he make a mockery of the country he loves? So, you know, so that's the heart of my story. And once I find a seed that drives me, it'll take me all the way through the production process.
Well, let's talk about Patrick Kavanagh, the film that you mentioned that was at the South Bank recently. I mean, it has some amazing interviewees in it, but there is Seamus Heaney. He also turns up in Golden Boy, your film about Patrick Scott, the artist. So how did that come about? Was he somebody that you'd known? I mean, because of course he was big in Irish theatre as well, not just poetry.
Patrick.
Seamus Heaney.
No, Seamus wasn't in my Patrick Kavanagh film.
No, I thought he was actually.
No.
He's definitely in the Patrick Scott.
It's interesting that because in Patrick Kavanagh, No Man's Fool, which is a very complex film, and it was the centenary of his birth, I think, at the time. But later on, when I did film Seamus Heaney for Patrick Scott, and I said, a lot of people in RT were saying, you've got to have you for the Patrick Kavanagh film. And I said, no, I only wanted people that knew, or, you know, I didn't want hagiography. And he thanked me in a way for that. So I again, the approach was, Kavanagh was a poet from Monaghan who walked all the way to Dublin, wanted to be a poet. He was basically a farmer. And after his first book of poems, The Ploughman, was published by Macmillan, an esteemed English poet came to visit him, imagining that Kavanagh was some, wonderful person living in a house like a great poet. He found him ploughing the field with poems scattered along the hedge. And so he had a very difficult life. Dublin was very difficult in the 50s. It was a very hard, whereas in France, when you hear about, the great clubs and bars where cliques of artists hung out, or in different countries, Salvador Dali, Dublin was totally different. The artists in court, they all hung out in a bar called MacDade's. So you had Brendan Behan, you had Patrick Kavanagh, you had Smiley from the Irish Times. So it was very hard to navigate. And Kavanagh didn't trust a lot of people. He was quite garrulous. He had a reputation. But I wanted, again, to kind of dig under that and find out who was this man that wrote some of the most beautiful poetry. We all know Raglan Road, one of the greatest poets of his time. And Heaney nodded to that, and all the other poets. But he was a very unlucky man. His first book, The Green Fool, he wrote a passage in it when he came to Dublin. He went to a library. Where do you meet great poets? And so he said, go visit Oliver St. John Gogarty, who was a doctor from Harley Street. And he said he knocked on the door and a maid answered. He said, I suppose every poet needs a mistress. And Gogarty sued him. And Samuel Beckett said, don't do that. But he did go ahead and sue. And The Green Fool was shredded and had to be redone. So again, unlucky, always unlucky, just about. But the last set of poems set on the Grand Canal was kind of where he found peace. And he became a Dubliner in a way, but never had it as one great line by the writer, was always striving for a shilling for the gas, So he really was that quintessential poor poet. And that's why I call it No Man's Fool in a way.
The film does then have a take on rural Ireland as well. I mean, he's an emblematic figure of rural Ireland, isn't he?
Yeah,
Because
well,
he could write so well.
well, The Great Hunger, which is a fantastic long poem in a way.
Mm.
But the police called to his house on Haddington Road, where he was living with his brother Peter, who was a teacher, and they said, "We're not here to arrest you, Mr. Captain, but we want to warn you. There's some salacious things in your poetry." And he got scared, and he took out the offending section. And it wasn't until many years later, John Montague republished the full poems, and it went back in. So he was a bit terrified of the establishment. He had one lucky ally, extraordinary in Ireland. If you mentioned Archbishop McQuaid, the Tibetan of the church, who would have all sex ties examined, and was watching him. But he became a good friend of Patrick. I don't know why. He always threw him a few bob and kind of looked after him. An infamous story where he called on him Christmas Day to check him out, see he was okay. But Patrick, he sent a chauffeur to knock at the door. But Patrick had a woman in, and he said, "Oh, I can't talk to her now. Tell him to come back in a couple of hours." So he did rely on a lot of friends, very close friends like McDara Woods, Elaine Crillahan, who you may have met in the South Bank. But they were all around Cavan, and they kind of created a shell. But he really understood the female psyche, and I think they, in Raglan Road, Moriarty was the woman he wrote that song about, so, and she remained friends till the end of her life until she got married. There's always this, he was always looking for love. He never quite found it, but he knew how to write about love.
Mm.
Yeah.
You found some great friends of his as well, some very plain-spoken friends of Kavanagh.
Well, I found a few, the two boys I found in Monaghan, and I let them perform Terry Flynn because they had done it, an amateur production. So again, it was like, this will make great visuality, and it won't be too poncy actors trying to realize. And I found an old girlfriend, Deirdre Manifold, who was absolutely so sweet and wonderful, and we called the day they said goodbye to each other and the reasons why. So I think whoever's going to appear in your film, I always try to provide, in that case, Seamus, not because Seamus would be brilliant, but trying to find people who could enliven the screen. And he was, in a way, the people's poet. T.P. McKenna says in the film, we all knew about Yeats and the great poets that came out, but Kavanagh was the first from the very soil, So that's the kind of, and so Ploughman, even the titles of the poems, Stony Grey Soil of Monaghan, and then his beautiful poems on the canal, Stilly Water, so forth. So so you're playing like a tale of two cities. The country boy who becomes a Dublin guy, and then he became quite a modernist. My film ended at a certain point, but for reasons. But Ginsberg loved him. He there's no record filmically, but he at that big bash in the Albert Hall of the Beat Poets, Kavanagh was there, and he loved Beckett. And he died too young. It's like a person that's just like that band that almost nearly made it. He made it, but he never made it in his own time. Near the end, Terry Flynn became a very successful stage production. So, and he got married in the end to Helena Maloney, longtime partner. But then also, so too long for this, it also was a controversy with his brother who stole some of Helena's letters, and so there became a fraction, even in debt. So Peter retained some copyright in America. Helena and the estate held the rest. But it's very difficult for some to say, I want to publish all the poems in America. No, there's going to be people suing you, even to this day. So he was unlucky.
Yeah. Did you have dealings with the estate then when you were making the film?
I dealt with the Irish estate. The Americans just said no. I avoided that. But an interest in the Irish estate, money that's made every year from Patrick Kavanagh's poetry, they give it to a poor poet. This is a very nice thing to do. They always select somebody who needs the money, and it's kind of like Patrick, what poor poet, because that's what Patrick was. So that was very generous, as opposed to trying to make money out of him. But
Yeah.
it's again, it's there's a lot of untold stories. You know, Helena Maloney, when she died, she was buried with Kavanagh, and it's really how I made the film. And all of a sudden, on the day of the Enniskillen bombs, there was a news report that Peter Kavanagh had been arrested for smashing the headstone of Helena Maloney. And that still goes on today. I'm still campaigning with some people to have her headstone reinstated, because every year people come on Kavanagh's special day and presidents stand over that grave, and it's desecrated. There's no marking. So there's still kind of after the event sort of sadness. But mainly I love reading him. I love the way he took no prisoners. You know, he just lambasted anything that was in front of him. He even ran his own magazine for a while, went bankrupt, called Kavanagh's Weekly, published on its own money. You know?
Didn't he? Wasn't there you know, he upset somebody with that as well, didn't he?
He said about a lot of people. But what happened was just kind of it was a small magazine, like tiny magazine called The Leader, and somebody wrote in it that Patrick Kavanagh, although he's a great poet, he's an old codger. He won't talk, and I should buy him a whiskey and this, that, and he was furious, so he sued him, and he lost. He reappealed, and they awarded £1 to him. But he was getting old. He only had one lung. He was suffering. His great friend Leland Bardwell, great writer to boot, she looked after him in the last days, and in the end, he was. The nagging of whiskey was the only thing that could calm him down, you know. And he spent a lot of time in hospital. Some lovely poems about the hospital bed, and the ordinariness of life, whether it be a flower or a stream where he used to sit on the canal, that became his kind of solace, you know. And what I like about Cavan is, in a way, he's still being, even at the South Bank, a lot of non-Irish people never heard of the dude. You know, they came along. And when they were selling the books outside of all the other literature, nobody had thought of Kavanagh. I heard once, why didn't you bring some Kavanagh? I need to get, they wanted. So, you know.
Yeah.
I love the man.
Yeah. Well.
And a great honor for a documentary filmmaker to be allowed to make a film on a titan of literature, but without all the usual pressure. You know, I said, no, it's going to be very visual. And when people do speak, they will be speaking as if they're talking about their friend, you know. And in a way, Elaine at Southern, I think she's the only one that's still alive from that great bunch of people who appeared in the film, you know. So I suppose it's a document, and it stands the test of time, and it's there for people to enjoy in all sorts of ways, scholars or poets alike.
So going a bit off the literary theme, you made one film that's sort of about architecture, modernist architecture in Ireland, and that's the Talking to My Father. Yeah.
Well, that was a funny one, because I was sharing an office in Lad Lane in Dublin with an architect, Simon Walker. We had been in Bagot Street, and he was a great friend of Patrick Scott, the painter I made a film with. My premises went. It was during that boom time. I found an old building in Lad Lane and went there. And Simon came with all these huge boxes. And it was on the side, it was Simon Walker, Dorothy Walker, the famous Irish curator, who, you know, she brought a sense of Ireland to London. She was a great world person. And I said, what are all the boxes? He said, oh, that's my father. I said, you know, he was an architect. He studied with Le Corbusier and what's the other guy come to me in America, the modernist.
Oh, Frank Lloyd Wright?
No,
not him.
No. He comes to me. It's true. But anyway, I did what they call a pilot. I showed a little pilot to tell me if I'll send it into the Arts Council. There was an annual award, and I realized that Simon wasn't very good in this pilot. So I went back and said, I tell you what, go into the room and write him a letter. You know, write your father a letter. Because he had a problem, because basically outside of being an architect, there was a fracture between Simon and his father, because when modernism collapsed because of the oil, gas crashing, modern buildings were out. We don't want you anymore. All the other architects readapted to whether pastiche Georgian or whatever it was, but he refused. Like the oak tree, he refused to bend, as Simon says. And I sent the little film into the Arts Council with 20 other, shortlisted with 10 other people. And I remember going into the room and saying, yeah, it's going to be a great film. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And they always have an English person on the board. So I don't know why. And this guy was very nice. He said, so did Simon write a letter and give it to you and you thought that would be a good idea? I said, no. I told Simon, I came up to you for Simon to write the letter. And when I left the rooms, that was seeing me and said, give him the money, because that they understood that I wasn't just following, I was originating a route through the film. So that letter, in a way, was the thread. Now, Robin Walker could have been a plumber for all I cared. If the same thing happened, I wasn't obsessed about the architecture, although it came into it naturally. If he was a painter, it was more this kid, this boy, trying to reach his father through the buildings that he left behind. You know? So again, that was essentially it. But it turned out to be a very successful film about the modernism in Ireland. You know, it did well here in other countries and went all around the world, where I didn't realize there was such a big demand for architectural films. So at the American Design Film Festival, showed it 3 or 4 times. It went to Beirut, it went here. I think we got about 6 screenings in South Korea. You know, so again, you don't know what's going to happen, what sort of journey your wee film is going to go on. You know, but they kind of find you, and it just has a life of its own. But I love that film as well. Yeah, it was a departure for me. It was a departure for me because he was alive. Robin was alive.
Yeah.
Patrick Kavanagh, I was thinking about something that passed. Always. So sometimes I enjoy having the person still here, like Patrick Scott, or else you're talking about someone like John Ford, but you're digging in to the past via people that were part of his world. You know?
I think, I mean, one of the pleasures of the film was learning that there was such a thing as Irish modernism, and going to the buildings. And one of the iconic buildings was the tourist board building, wasn't it? But that was, I mean, the unity of the building comes across in the film, but it was torn down, wasn't it?
It was torn down a while ago. And even Simon's friends, when he was making the film about his father, said, you're going to have real problems with that building because nobody likes it. You know? It really was. And it was his first building. And he was kind of controversial architect because he did the Opera House in Cork and people hated it. But once they got inside, they loved it. And he was of that architect. So the outside is not important. It's what inside. And so, but it was the first lash of modernism. And Ireland was trying to develop a modern state. The government were behind. But again, the same English fellow who came over, who essentially wrote the check, he came to see the rough cut. And he said, that building up the road, is that still there? He said, yeah. I said, it's fucking beautiful. And I said, it was great that somebody understood how precious it was, but not enough. And it was bulldozed shortly after. So the film is the only record really of it. But again, that film was in the film Simon going through the old building, seeing what, and he was saying it was odd. In this case, he said the exterior is what's beautiful because Ireland was great for cement, so brickwork. He said inside you can tear it all out. I don't care. It could have been saved. And this idea, which is in Simon's mind, that we knock down a lot of buildings without really appraising them. And what they mean and how they can be reimagined, you know, for a better time, you know, as opposed to here, I don't want to say the word Grenfell and all the rest, but the whole horrible approach to architecture in general, and how it fits into people's lives. And he made sure that simple, very beautiful Irish tourist office blended with the Georgian house beside it. Even though it was different, he had the Georgian proportions. And he loved Georgian Dublin, Robin Walker, as to boot.
Well, it gives a sense of the ideas behind, that there's always an idea behind a building, and there's a university campus, isn't there, in the film? And I just remember an amazing shot or an amazing picture of girls doing kind of calisthenics or something in a huge gym.
Yeah.
Was that?
That was Wesley College.
Right.
On the outskirts of Dublin. Again, he was very into the idea of that children will use this and not to lock them up as prisoners, and create canopies and great outdoor spaces. And they really loved it. A couple of students were there, they almost didn't want to leave when their time was up. And in UCD, the restaurant, although they blocked it, it was one of that, what we call open architecture, where, you could see all the floors and people on them. And again, it was quite a radical building. And a great living Irish artist, Bobby Balla, designed all the screens. And I only found out after I made the film, but they had symbols on them relating to the French student riots. So Robin was actually trying to create a space where students could have radical ideas. He's quite a radical man. And in a way, that's why he went in on himself. He didn't really communicate too much with students. He became obsessed with them just writing about architecture. But he came back once at the end of the film, to build a tiny little church for a priest that had no money in a working class area. And even though it's made of corrugated iron and all the rest, it has a great beauty of skylight and light coming into the church. So, he had a beautiful mind. Yeah.
The Patrick Scott film, Golden Boy, that is very intensely focused on him. And you must have spent quite a lot of time just with him. I mean, there's scenes of him with his cats, and he's sort of pottering around. And he was in his 80s, wasn't he, when the film was made?
Yeah, and it was as if I was traversing between, again, what's great about Dublin, it's small, it's local enough. But Patrick and Robin Walker, they worked together, they holidayed together in Boho Bui and Seamus Heaney. They were all moving in this lovely little circle. So when I made a film about Patrick, I ended up living next door, and he was the father of Irish modernism in painting. Had a couple of exhibitions here. He was kind of like a Buddhist. He got into gold. He was the first person to apply gold to unprimed canvas. But I was living next door to him. But again, going back to what I said earlier, you're always trying to find the route in, whether you write a letter or this or that. And with Patrick, I said, look, what I'm going to do first, I'm just going to interview for several days, because he was old. So I literally started with, where were you born? Any birds? And it went in, and all, representing Ireland at the Venice Biennale, falling in love, he was gay, his partner, and then going literally, in this case, not trying to be smart, but going from beginning to end. But the film opens with him having a cup of coffee, and he's talking to his cat. And because there's going to be this big retrospective in the New Lane Gallery, and he's telling the cat, we're going to an exhibition. They're going to show all my life. And the film ended, and the cat, when Seamus Heaney came to visit him, I remember Seamus walking in the door in Bagot Lane and whispering to the camera, go down, don't do it right, just pan down to the ground. And when he did, there was a cat, that's cat going in after Seamus, and the cat ended the film. So you hold on to those little nuggets preciously. And the last shot, I left the camera locked. I said, all you have to do is hit that button when you get up in the morning to have breakfast. And that was the last scene. It's in the film. I guess it's 60 seconds for the credits. Well, I have about 12 minutes of that. It's very, very precious as an outtake. But again, that was my thing with Patrick. And we got on so well. We got on so well. lovely guy, living next door. And sometimes when I was editing the film and hearing Pat, the cat used to climb over Patrick's wall, thinking Pat was in with me because he could hear him talk. And he's trying. I said, "No, that's a film. The real Pat is asleep. Go home. Go home." Anyway,
yeah. I mean, when he did the Biennale, there was a bit of a scandal around that, wasn't there? That I mean, he didn't always have an easy time, did he, with the authorities in Ireland?
Well, he Louis Le Brocquet, the other great painter. There was a problem with Venice. Something happened one year, and there was no more Irish participation. Some sort of Irish government or whatever, and then it restarted via Dorothy Walker, and Louis Le Brocquet won, and he won some special award. And when you win a special award, your government honours you. It's usually the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Pat was the next up, and he won the award. And nobody turned up for him. When he went in to get his reviews, wherever it was, the Irish government refused to pay for it. He had to print his own catalogue. So there was this, in a way, it's terrible to say, but there's a kind of hard to explain, but Irish theatre, although it's very successful, was oral. You didn't have any great visual sets. We had a visual blankness that some say went back to the famine and when British taxed windows, so people were in the dark talking. So it was took a long time to develop, say, let's call it visual skills. And in a way, the governments of the day didn't really have any regard for art, and artists. Didn't give them much heed. So they were, theatre, you do a little bit better because of Yeats and the Abbey, but painters had a hard time. And even had a very hard time to break out into the outer world. And still to this day, I was talking to Valdemar Janicek at Shane McGowan's exhibition, saying nobody has really yet focused on the history of Irish art here, like what was going on in Ireland. It's kind of like it really hasn't been explored unless you were famous outside Ireland, like in Paris, like Orphan, or people like that, or Jack Yeats. But what was happening in Ireland, what they're doing all through the seismic periods, particularly the 60s, troubles, and whatever. It's actually quite a vibrant history, and particularly at the Scott period, modernism, and so forth. So I tried to have a little bit of that in the film, but that wasn't my mission. I was trying to express this great modernist, and it was interesting as well. A lot of people, not a lot of them, the producers really wanted me to stress his gay period. Now, I alluded to, I wasn't hiding it. I said, well, what's the difference? If he was married to a woman, it would be no big deal. His boyfriend, she died, it was sad, but I'm not going to go into all that sort of thing. But I did ask him once, where did gay people drink when you were young? He said, in the last 6 stools in Tobin's bar. It was just where I used to drink. But but that gay was obviously in Catholic Ireland was a bit tough. But at the same time, most Dublin people were acceptable of it. But be a little bit careful.
Yes, and he was fairly matter of fact, wasn't he? Yeah. He there was the lovely portrait, and he had nice words about the whole thing. But yes, you didn't get the impression that he wanted to bang on about it particularly.
No. And again, I don't know if you're familiar with people like Michael McLean and Hilton Edwards. They were actually both British, but they started the Gate Theatre. Yeah. The Gate Theatre were doing all, if you like, your Ibsens and this, that, and the other, and the Abbey were doing all the Irish things. And they used to call the two theatres used to call them Sodom and Begorra. So Michael, but Michael Dayswin were openly gay, like really, and he'd go down
very flamboyant,
and all the traders, "Hiya, Michael," and so there was, it's complex. Yeah.
Well, we'll move on to the other literary. I want to talk a little bit about Yeats.
Mr. Jack Yeats, William.
WB, the great WB. So your the film about Yeats, the battle of Blythe Road. Well, this brings us to Niall McDevitt, who he sort of seems like, Niall was your muse in some kind of way. You made quite a lot of films with Niall. Was that a fairly early one, the Blythe Road one?
That was numero one. It was kind of numero one. There was a tiny little one before that where I filmed on an Oscar Wilde walk, and I ran out of footage, and I only had a little iPhone. But that was where I met him. I met him through Rosalind Scanlon, the cultural director of the RCC. And I had come over from Dublin to show Patrick Kavanagh at the Irish Cultural Centre. And pretty much the next day, COVID hit, 13th of March or whatever it was. And the Irish government the Irish Cultural Centre followed the Irish government's rules on COVID, and they closed down. Britain closed down 10 days later. And all the staff, they were obviously going to get some sort of remuneration, but there was no work, no job. Place was closed. Ipso facto, done. And I suggested, why don't you start a digital platform? And they said, what would that be? And so it could be you, Suzi, you play the violin, I'd teach you how to shoot it on the phone, I'd put it up, it could be a poet, it could be whatever. And then Niall told me the story about the Battle of Blythe Road and W.B. Yeats, and particularly a spat with Alistair Crowley, because there was seemingly an ISIS temple on Blythe Road, and Yeats was one of the biggest players in that temple. And so literally, it was COVID. I filmed it. It was just a little film on the iPhone. But Niall McDevitt, for those who know, he eats up the screen, and he's famous for his walks around London. He's just so magnificent. And we did it. Again, my little iPhone, not even something to hold it in traffic. And it was interesting because there's a cafe on Blythe Road called Georgie, which ironically was the name of Yeats's wife. And Niall said, listen, be careful. The guy who owns the restaurant, he hates me because I'm always bringing down these Yeatsians. It's okay. So I shot it very wide, and then I kept creeping up. And eventually I won the guy over, and he let us sit down and have a coffee, and I read a poem by Yeats. That was my first introduction. And the first time I put it out on ICC Digital, somebody said, nice film. Shame about the traffic and noise, And I hate that negativity, I said, and Ian St. Clair, the great psychogeographer, wrote, this is a great piece of work, and the traffic adds to it. I said, okay. So that was really the beginning of this, really in a lot of ways, an untold story. And then I realized that Niall knew so much about Yeats, and particularly his London life. In Ireland, we all know about his Irish life, Cool, the Swans, and this and that. But I didn't know about him growing up in London, being very poor, his father not making much money. His sisters, I think, went on to work with William Morris, and then going back and forth. And he went to a school that is now very posh, but at the time was quite a poor school. And how he developed, in a lot of ways, his skills as a poet in London. And I believe that some of his famous lines we think to Ireland, but they don't. They refer to places in London, So I was interested that Niall introduced me to people I knew in some sort of way, but added a much more profound understanding of who they were in terms of Ireland, England. Because that's very important to Niall, and London is very, very important. So focusing on stories that people in Ireland didn't know about, it's not the usual. We're not giving the usual guff. But here's a little film that illustrates something, but not only the story, Niall's passion to tell that story.
I went on a Blythe, well, it wasn't just Blythe Road. I went on a W.B. Yeats walk with Niall, and there was a whole group of us. And we got the story, and we stood outside the Isis temple and looked up at the windows. He did all these walks all around London, and he was so erudite. And I mean, he walked very fast. That was the other thing, that
Yes,
he would sort of glide on to the he'd glide on to the next waypoint, and sometimes leave people behind. He moved so fast.
yes, yeah. I went on from doing that. I now bought a little microphone. I was still on my own. I had no crew. I usually have a crew, but we then did a film. He told me the story about James Joyce, and Nora Barnacle, James's wife, as everybody assumed she was. But it turned out in 1931 in England, they brought out a law that you could marry anybody you want. Second cousin, doesn't matter. But with one rule, you must live in London for a year. So James Joyce and Nora came over to London, lived in Camden Grove for a year, and then they got married through a whole lot of controversy. And particularly the people back home, his family, said, "What? Nora isn't married? You've been living in sin with my..." And so forth. But that was a fairly enjoyable story. But what Niall did, he turned that simple story on its head, because he opened the film by bringing in all the contemporaries of Joyce, and he went on a kind of Bloomsday walk through London. So he took me to Ezra Pound's house, great supporter of Joyce in the early days, T.S. Eliot, and we went on this kind of literary unlocking. And then somehow he made sense of it all, and then we finally arrived at James Joyce's house to finish off the story. And it was funny because some guy was living in the flat they lived in, and he kept coming up and down the stairs and leaving. And Niall just took it in his stride. And in documentary terms, this is great for me because this is life. It's not just, go with the flow. So those two films. And then I was living in London now. I wasn't going home. And William Blake, then this other guy started coming. I heard a little bit about him, but Niall was going to do 5 walks. So I said, okay, I'll film the whole lot of them. So it was William Blake and Thomas Paine, William Blake and Bedlam, the mental hospital, William Blake and the River Tyburn, William Blake and Swedenborg, and William Blake and Francis Bacon, because they both lived in Soho. And while I was doing that film, editing the first film, Thomas Paine, which later would get premiered at the Portobello Film Festival, Niall took me and Rosalind, who was my partner, to lunch, and he told me the news that he had a little time left, and that moment, and that I had to leave and go out and have a cigarette. It was just devastating. But we got through it, and I finished the first film, Thomas Paine, just in time, and he came to the last screening. So, and I'm still editing those films in the other room here, so I hear his voice every day, and it's quite strange at times, But Niall seems to be with me, some sort of shadowing what I'm doing, He talks in one film about William Blake after he died. I think it's in Thomas Paine. And somebody would go to Blake's wife, Catherine, to buy a painting, and she'd ask Blake, should I give them in colour or black and white? He said, oh, colour, darling. Should I give them a reduction? No. So he communicated after his death with Catherine. And I think Niall, and maybe it's people who die young, they hang around a lot longer than those that have had a good age. So he became a great new friend and really introduced me to London. And then his last book of poetry, London Nation, which you referred to earlier, the beautiful book, that arrived the very day before he passed. And he had it in his hand when he passed. And we had a great launch, as you know, in London. I brought 5 poets to Dublin to celebrate the launch in Dublin of that book. Mamie Foyle, Roddy McDevitt, Niall's brother, Julie Goldsmith, his great, lovely partner. So we're kind of continually not celebrating, but also making sure people know this man lives, this Dublin man, who became, a bit like Calvin Countryman became a Dubliner, Niall McDevitt became a Londoner. And I realized, when looking at the book a little while ago, that on the cover, Swinburne said something, I'm doing something in London. And then he scribbled that out. He said, no, I'm doing something for London Nation. And that was the inspiration for Niall. So I love going on journeys with people. I love not knowing anything. You know, I've never made a film. I didn't know anything about William Blake. I learned, in this case, this man walking, as you have been on all over London for hours, and then he's gone. He's gone like a rocket to the next pit stop, and I'm trying to get some shots or whatever. But you're continually running after him. But I thought we had a great future working together. I mean, my dream was, I'm going to have you on BBC4. We're going to have our own show, you know, whatever, stuff like that. But he was my London boy.
Well, I mean, he put so much work into those walks. And I know London quite well, but the connections that he made, not just thematically, but actually physically, you'd be going he'd find a tiny little alley and you'd dart up it and you'd pop out somewhere else. You just think, how does he really covered the terrain incredibly. He called himself the poet topographer on his blog, and he wove so many things in. It was just quite amazing to me how he managed it. He was a real scholar, but in terms of his illness, I didn't really know what was going on, and I didn't need to know particularly, but he came and gave a talk at Halloween, or around Halloween, at the National Liberal Club.
Right.
And I wanted to get him in somehow, and it was a sort of, Halloween macabre theme. And he said, well, I've written these sonnets about the heads on London Bridge, which is just so brilliant, because he was... he knew a lot about Shakespearean and Marlowean London as much as anything. So I said, brilliant, come along and read them. And somebody came up afterwards and said that guy is absolutely amazing. I've never heard poetry read like that.
Yes.
And this was the famous occasion when he was discussing the idea of the heads and decapitation and traitors. And he started to talk about Cromwell.
Oh, yeah.
And how Cromwell was dug up and decapitated and treated like his corpse was treated as though he was a traitor. And Niall just began to laugh hysterically. Yeah. I mean, I thought he was having a fit. He just could not stop laughing at the idea of, Cromwell, the evil Cromwell. Anyway, Julie, his partner.
And that redecapitation, putting his entrance, happened in Connacht Place, and we did that at the River Tiber. And it was ironic because when Cromwell was in Ireland, he said to anybody who didn't agree with what he was saying, he said, "The hell, Connacht being the fourth province." So he was saying the irony that this happened in Connacht Place was a kind of a payback time for the Irish,
Absolutely.
But his attention to detail is extraordinary. His research, I didn't realize how well researched he was, because I do a radio show, Bright Side of the Road, and we had him on as a guest many times. And he came into the show. I said, I want to change things around a bit, Niall. We're going to do this instead. And he said, no. And I realized that, no, this man, even though he comes across as he actually is prepared, and he didn't want to go off script. So I said, no, okay, let's do what we agreed. So he harnessed the ideas in his mind and then put them into action, and did it as if he was talking to people on the street, as he did. But it was so finely tuned, And sadly, God knows what happened, but he was writing a book or an essay on Chaucer. That was the last commission he had, and I don't know what would have happened there. I visited Chaucer's place in Talbot's Yard, just near the River Thames, when we were doing Bedlam. He told a story, I'll tell it to you anyway. And Blake was quite poor, and he says, Blake showed this painting he made at the Canterbury Pilgrims to this guy. He said, this is what I'm working on. And the guy said, oh, that's nice. And he went off to this other guy, Stoddard, and he told Stoddard, you should do a print. So this other guy rushed it out. By the time when Blake heard of it, it was too late. This guy was selling all his prints. But he went down, and Niall compared Blake to a psychogeographer like him, and he came down to study the terrain, and he did his own version, and he told Stoddard his pilgrims were going the wrong way. because he had studied topography,
Yeah.
So that detail again is an example of Niall's research.
Yeah. Yeah. And also his intuition, his intuitiveness, that he's able to sort of get inside a character like Blake as well as he did. I mean, it was 5 walks, which each one went on for many hours.
Yes.
And so we would all, we'd all be told, meet here. And then,
Yes.
I mean, this Swedenborg one was very interesting. We all met at the Docklands Light Railway. I think we met in Shadwell and just, wove our way along. And, he knew that area really well. And we had the Battle of Cable Street that he dropped in. These were sort of alternative, kind of radical London walks, weren't they?
Well, that's right. They're not, again, it's just me with my little camera, but I'm very proud of them. I've done an awful lot of research on what I've previewed to it, Thomas Paine and Bedlam, the River Tiber, we're going to preview in October. I suppose, I don't know who's watching the show, but I'm trying to get somebody to help us get through to finish these films, finance some small amount of finance, because I think they're going to be very valuable, both as films to watch, but also for future Blakean scholars. So I'm trying to get the whole 5 done and dusted, and finished and ready. Just I feel like I'm on a train with Niall, and I feel like I did make him a promise. I will finish these films. He thanked me the last time we met. I said, "We go on. We go on now." So that's my mission.
And his last public appearance was when the first film was shown in the Portobello Film Festival, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And he lived across the road on Portobello Road. He was very, very frail. I won't go into the detail, but I got him a seat at the back, and Julie was there. There was a lot of friends there. And I was doing my usual babble introduction to the film. And Niall put up his hand. Do you want to say something? Not yes. And as you know, he was a Republican, anti-Marxist, and he just said, "The Queen is dead." She had died. The Queen is dead. Enjoy this limited time where we have a republic. So that was his last, I suppose, public speech at his own film. So that was fantastic. And he invited us back to the wee house with Julie. We all gathered in the garden and had a glass of wine.
Yeah, it was an amazing party, actually. So for a lot of us, it would have been the last time that we saw Niall, and we would sort of go in one by one, really, because he was so...
Yes.
I mean, he kind of burned with intensity, though, didn't he? And I remember having a conversation with him about the Isle of Wight and books about the Isle of Wight. He wouldn't have had time to read those books, but we had an interesting conversation.
It's funny because this very morning, because Julie has a cottage on the Isle of Wight, and his last Max Crow Reeves and people took him there, but Swinburne was there, so he went to visit Swinburne. So it felt like whatever my last days, or your last days, or anybody's last days, Niall's last days were in special spiritual places that helped him cross over to some degree, One always, I think one always hates the idea of anybody dying. But in most cases, it's a rock star, this, that, and the other. Something about a poet, like what have we lost? What would we not? What would we have got? So, in a way, you cherish what you have, and it's quite interesting. A lot of his friends, because again, I didn't know anything about Blake. But a lot of his friends come up to me, like John Crow. Thank you so much, Shay, for having done this, because sometimes we lose the opportunity to say, "Oh, my granny has great stories. I'll film her." So I'm so glad, without any production backup, I'm doing this because you're my friend. I think you're brilliant. So that was enough motivation.
Yeah. And his funeral was quite an extraordinary thing because there were far too many people to fit in the chapel,
Yes,
and people were sitting on the floor and people were waiting
yes,
outside. And then, of course, there was an ex-flame who came running up the aisle
yes,
and sort of
yes,
tried to do a sort of occult ceremony.
yes. I know.
And you can
And then
imagine Niall going, "This is brilliant."
I know, and the poor priest he had to get ready to his next engagement. Was trying to get us all out of there. And what's the song they all sing at the proms? William Blake.
Oh,
Uh,
Jerusalem.
yeah,
Oh,
that
yes.
they got that in, you know, and then
Yeah, everybody suddenly started singing Jerusalem.
yeah, and then we went.
Yeah, and the poor priest is trying to get us all
I
out.
know, and then we went to the tabernacle, and there was our duly organized food, and every poet known
Yeah,
to man go to speak or read
yeah.
some of his poetry. So it was a very fulsome, lovely, warm day, you know. So you know he was well remembered and beautiful, like his obituaries in the Guardian, the Irish
Mm,
Times,
mm.
all the high end, and later on a few weeks later, the is it the British Museum or the
Oh, yes,
library?
the British Library. I couldn't go to that, but there was an
Yeah,
event at the
but there
British
was
Library,
there was a
wasn't there?
lot. It was great to see that you know that people did know he was the real deal. But I remember, I mean, he wrote a beautiful poem about Shane MacGowan,
Mm.
which I had on the radio, which I eventually got to Shane via his sister, and he read it. He listened to it because it was an Niall reading, and he said, "Play again, play again." They
Oh.
did. He said, "I like that. I like that." So I would love Niall to have known that Shane, who he had met, really liked his poem.
Mm.
Really liked his poem. And another poem that always stood in my mind, he did on the radio, was again about the River Tyburn, which led to all those hangings in that period. The Christmas shoppers in Oxford Street, and did they know? Did they know that underneath them there was a river of blood while they all ran around
Mm.
trying to buy their knickknacks? So he found unusual ways into his poetry and his poetry of ideas. And I don't know if it's a common thing in poetry. Again, in McGowan, it's always one, get the poem, the barrel. Two, they're like little plays, poetry plays, you know, very dramatic.
Mm.
Yeah, work. Anybody out there, go try and get a copy of London Nation or BW was the earlier first book poems published
Yeah,
by Waterloo Press.
I think he did 3, didn't he? I've
Oh,
got the firing slits. That's
I
one.
don't have that. I've been trying to find a copy of that.
I've got a
Hard
signed
to
copy.
get. Oh, great.
Yeah, he signed it for me. Well, if you remember in the Tyburn walk, we were somewhere I think in Mayfair, and he
Yeah,
had us all sort of pretty much lying down in the road because
yeah.
the Tyburn Brook was flowing through a
Yeah.
grating,
Yes, that's
and
in the film. Yeah,
everybody had to leap back because occasionally a cab would go by or something. But
yeah,
yes, he had this way of making
yes,
things come incredibly alive.
yeah. And
And
I went up to Bognor Regis. We had a little celebration. Rachel Cyril, and because Blake lived in Bognor
yeah,
Regis, that's where he was arrested and hanging out naked with the wife. But and a lot of small but intimate people gathering for Niall in Bognor Regis. It was just an extraordinary day. But one girl, you may notice, she said, and I think it was Naomi or somebody didn't realize, she said, hold up BW, his book of poetry, to the mirror. And it's WB, William Blake.
ah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean? I always thought it was like flip side, like a
Mm.
record. Where did you get the side BW? But it's William Blake.
Ah,
Interesting.
yeah. Well, yeah. Bognor was great fun, and again, people have written poems for Niall. He's sort of going on inspiring people.
That's very
You know.
interesting. It's very interesting because I've heard now 5, 6, 7, 8 poems, and I spoke to Naomi and John O'Donoghue, who's a great friend,
Mm.
and I said, why don't poems to Niall McDevitt publish them in some short form? Because
Yeah, a little pamphlet.
they're quite intimate and they're diverse. They're quite
Mm.
diverse. They're all coming
Mm.
from a different point. but it's kind of remembering Niall. It's again this idea. And when he got to Dublin, I got a check from some government body on Poetry Ireland, and we bought the poets in my films, Yeats, and we showed it. We showed him a place called the Teachers Club. It was the I'd seen Paul and Ian read it. I said, "Get the Teachers Club. It's great." And the irony of it was that James Joyce and John McCormack used to go to the Teachers Club, as it was then, for singing lessons from a man called Vincent O'Brien. And then the girl who sent me a video, it turned out that Vincent O'Brien was Niall's great uncle. It was all too much. It was all too much.
Wow.
You know? And that later on, Niall's grandparents lived in the building. So all these kind of, but anyway, on the night, Belvedere College, where Joyce went to school and Niall went to school, college, and he used to go from Dunleary, which is about 12 miles outside the city, and he always talked about coming in every day was the big adventure. And all these students, friends of his, turned up, and Julie met them, and she was delighted, Niall's partner. And she asked, what was he like? He said, well, he was a better sportsman than all of us. He was smarter than all of us. And worst of all, he was better looking than all of us. but it was great, all these Belvedere boys. Again, so by the time we left Dublin, Dublin now does know a little bit more about the poet they didn't get to know. So there's a little parallel there between Yeats and Niall, the London poets, and what may have happened. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think he did leave quite a lot of papers, and maybe somewhere within that is the germ or the bulk of the Chaucer book, or maybe something that can be found.
No, it's very good because the lad, I can't remember his name, it's from Cork University, but they're in the middle now collecting all the papers and annotating them, and they will be housed in Cork, and Julie will still have the estate. So there's ongoing work. That's very exciting. I think we'll all know about that in about a year's time.
Yeah, brilliant. That is great news. And in the meantime, he's still hovering around. Just wandering around London, you're always finding little spots where Niall suddenly comes to mind. Like, that's where he talked about this or that. That's where he talked about. I mean, I went on lots of his walks thinking about it. In the end, he did a Emilia Lanier walk, Shakespeare's Dark Lady walk. Christopher Marlowe was a great one along the Thames, to Deptford. He's and you can hear his voice and see his smile for sure. Incredible person. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up with my 3 questions. I hope you've been having a think about them, but if not, you'll have to extemporize. First one is favourite artwork.
Well, my favourite artwork is the Mona Lisa.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Why is it the Mona Lisa?
I just love the smile, and I saw her at a time where I think if you go to the Louvre now, it's all pretty much cased off. But I was there when you could literally just sit for 25 minutes and just gaze into those eyes. I don't know what the power of it is, but it's just I love it. Yeah, Mona Lisa for me.
I think the power is the mystery of it, really. You know?
Yeah. I've been reading some of the mysteries, even Was It a Man? I don't know, but it's whatever it's whatever came out in the paintbrush that day or whatever was going on. But it's just, it's kind of like the way a lot of people would have a Che Guevara poster. I'd have the Mona Lisa.
Great. I like that. I like that a lot. What book should you have read by now that you haven't? Don't say Ulysses.
I'm not, because I read that.
Yes.
Okay, I found a way around that one. But I've been on a course for the last 4 weeks with Roz, a guy called Richard Chalman, I think it is, and it's Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, yes. How's that going?
It's not going well. I'm enjoying it anytime I go there, and I'm amazed at some people, what they say, and I'm reading it before I go, not knowing what is going on at all. I really don't know. But then somebody illuminates a passage. So I think, I don't think I'll ever read it, but I'd be happy enough to drop in and out of it, or hear it, or even hear it read. When I hear it being read, there's a book reading of it, then you can let it go. It's like a wild dream. One guy compared it to a video game or something, but Joyce is really, it was his last book. I think he just said, I'm doing what I'm doing, and he was going blind, and so it's not really a book in a lot of ways. It's a kind of stream of thought. But ironically, when I went with you and Julie to Bob and Norwegians, my friend Jim McGurk in Dublin said, he used a word, he invented a lot of words in Filmmaker Sé. One of them was quark, which later became a term in chemistry or science or
physics, maybe.
Physics, but it didn't exist at the time. And Jim said it was to describe the sound of the seagulls in Dublin. I found it, no, it wasn't, because when I went up to Bob and Regis, Joyce lived there for a few months in a hotel. He was getting medical treatment. I think T.S. Eliot was helping him out. And he wrote to T.S. Eliot, this is a very strange hotel. They turned the lights off in the bedroom at 11 o'clock. And I went to the house and paid my homage. But the minute I got off the train and heard those gulls, I said, there they are. So I mean, I love James Joyce's Dubliners. I love the simplicity. Blue Days is a bit harder, but I loved it. I loved his life. I loved his attitude. I loved how Niall described him as kind of an anarchist in Reluctant Groom, the film I made about him. And he's kind of like his books. He's endlessly fascinating, and that. We kind of lived in our time as opposed to the riddle of Shakespeare and all these people that you dig into. But there was some crumbs on the table, but not there was. It wasn't an empty board where you had to, you could find fragments and work your way into it. But it's the joy of language.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of another kind of crazy thing that Niall did that was very funny. We all went down to a festival, the Curious Arts Festival, and Niall had this idea that we should all read the entirety of, I think, A Season in Hell by Rimbaud. He was great on French poetry as well. He was deeply read. So the idea was that we read this entire collection, which is very hard going. We did it late at night, and I think they wisely put us in a tent at the very far edge of the, of the kind of festival grounds. And Niall brought this sort of a huge, almost a kind of, a gallon container of absinthe to keep us going, in the true French symbolist style. And it actually fell apart in chaos. I think we only got about halfway through. And by the end of it, we'd frightened off everybody who had turned up to watch. People were just fleeing. We were drinking absinthe and roaring out this crazy French poetry.
It's great, though, the way he champions people like Rimbaud and chained themselves to the railings to save the house, and it worked. Bun Hill Fields, where Blake and lots of other notables, the speculators wanted to remove the grey, and he fought them. He was one to make prime, and it's still there. So he didn't just opine about things that were important to hold on to. He fought, and sometimes he won. So he was a good fighter.
Yeah. Absolutely. And he just made magic happen. That's what I loved about him. Like, turn up, Niall will provide magic in whatever form. Okay, my last question. What kind of weird or funny feedback have you had about your work, your film work?
Well, that's a hard one. That's a hard one. I mean, sometimes every time I make a film, I always hope, it's a terrible thing to say, because I love emotion. I think people underestimate the power of emotion and even nostalgia. And so I always look and the lights come out, it's everybody crying. And somebody crying, I said, I got it. But I can't remember any nothing came to mind. The only thing that came to mind was when I showed it in the Irish Cultural Centre, we showed Yeats, Rupert Groom, and Thomas Paine. And everybody loved all three films, got a great reaction. This girl came up and said, your first two films are very, very good. But what was that last film about? And who were all those people standing around? And I didn't know how to respond. I said, well, they were the cast. They were you, you know. But it was just the way some people can sometimes totally misinterpret what you're trying to do, or else come with their own agenda and so on. But I've never had, at least I can't remember right now. You know, the only other thing I do remember when John Ford Dreaming the Quiet Man had its premiere in the Opera House in Cork, and the guy came out and he said, "What's that dude? The Bear? It's not Herzog. It's the other guy, the German. He held the record anyway."
Oh, not Herzog. Werner Herzog.
Is it? I think it's not him. He made a film about ski slopes. Is it Herzog? Anyway, he held the record, but he didn't anymore because we packed it. And Maureen was with me to speak on stage, but I knew she was in the audience, and her person looked up and said, "Listen, I have to warn you that if you have anything wrong in your film, Maureen is likely to scream at the screen, you know." and she was in the front row, and she didn't, you know. I mean, we had a lovely night, but at the end of the film, everybody loved. She spoke, and then she was going. I ran out after her, you know, and I got her in the car. I said, "Did you like the film?" "Why do you want to know?" I said, "I just need to know, Roy." You know, he said, "It was magnificent." You know, and I thought, okay, it's more. I don't remember instance, but I know it's a terrible nervous. No matter if it's a tiny film on an iPhone or a big film with a large budget, it's that nervousness of that first screening or letting it out into the world, and where people go with you on that journey. And I think the only time I ever, in a way, that little film, this woman misunderstood what these walks were, or just didn't get it. That's
Yeah. I mean, we were Niall's merry little band, weren't we?
Yeah.
He was, you know, it was like the Pilgrims, not the Pilgrims
Yes.
Progress, the Canterbury Tales. You know, he was leading us, and we were.
That's nice. It's funny because some people have seen it now, either a preview or all of it. I was really sorry in the second film the other person wasn't there. I said they went on that walk, or there's new faces coming, or some are dropping off. Sometimes bystanders hang out for a while.
Yeah. Yes, incidental things happening on the way, and just even things like sudden rainstorms that had us all sort of scattering, and we'd have to sort of take shelter. It was very. I mean, it's amazing to watch, having been on all the walks, you know, you see the faces. So, but I think it's not just for the people who were on the walks, you know. I think you're right. It's a record. It's a record of London, because London is changing the whole time. It's a record of Niall's London. They're already knocking things down, you know, along the paths of the walks. So
and he loved London. He loved its history. He loved that period when London was almost the London he in terms of politics and ideas, could have survived. You know, and I know it's not since yesterday, but you have a fragmented still that tension, but that London is its own nation. And I love the way he used to charm people. There's places where all the old names of London. And he's saying, "I know as an Irishman that you won't believe me, but its original name, Lon, comes from the Celtic." So he was trying to say London is a Celtic city and so forth. But you don't have to believe me on that.
That was very Niall. So,
and I remember when I was only here for a little while, and Neville and Niall, people around there were saying, "We're Londoners. We've been here a long time." I said, "Well, I'm a Dubliner. I'll never be a Londoner." And it was Niall or Roddy. So he said, "You're just in denial." And I think you are right. I think I wear the two hats now, cousin Niall. You know, I'm a Londoner and a Dubliner, and they're both great cities, and they've got
Yes.
a great shared history of ideas.
Yeah, and literature for sure. Yeah. Yeah, they both go together. I think you can be 100% Dubliner overlaid with 100% Londoner, and it still works.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for joining me.
Yes.
Wonderful to talk about all your work, and I hope the money floods in for the remaining Blake films, because they are truly extraordinary, and the music is great as well. The sort of gong music is
the gong, the gong, my gong. I remember saying to Niall, I said, I'm just going to have a gong.
Yeah,
I don't know why I got that. I got the gong,
and it sort of punctuates.
I found the gong from the Gong Shop in America, but funnily enough, we were at Walls in Wimbledon Common, and I saw a guy just last week, two guys with gongs. And I said, would you do, I have a gong, but I don't know why I own the corporate. Would you do a gong for me? He said, oh, yeah. So it's, the gong worked.
Yeah, very much so. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so
you,
much.
Niall. And I will see you soon.
Okay. God bless.
See you very soon.
So
and thank you. Thank you very much for watching. That has been completely fascinating. Totally recommend Niall's book, Niall McDevitt, London Nation. What an extraordinary person he was. But all these films, Sé, you'll find some of them online. I think Loop Line Films is what you need to look for. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.